The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop. And the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies. And fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
And as a wise man once said, me lose brain, uh-oh.
And tonight we're going to be talking about intelligence, or in some people's case, the lack thereof. What does intelligence mean in our culture? And how does our culture portray intelligence, especially in the media? Let's find out. So, to join us, of course, since Don and I can't quite keep up with this subject, we have Jack Ward helping us out.
Did you get that message?
What message?
The one I just sent you with my brain.
Oh. Jack.
I will try to use the old-fashioned words. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Jack. We keep forgetting you're from the future when mankind has evolved from the primitive form that we are now into giant floating brain people.
That's right, dum-dums. There's a little Flintstones reference for you people there.
Oh, the Great Gazoo.
The Great Gazoo. What a great character he showed up to be. It was fun.
Yeah, well, wasn't he really just there to kind of spice things up? Because probably they were worried that the show was getting a little dull for the kiddies.
Absolutely.
I mean, anytime a character like that appears, like him or Scrappy Doo or anyone else, it's usually because, the show is getting just a little bit too dull or highbrow, and they have to kind of dumb it down.
So is that Myxlpltzk do the same thing?
Pretty much.
It's basically the same character, but for Superman.
I'd be curious to know which one came first.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think,
probably Mix.
Yeah, what he said.
Myxlpltzk, or however you.
Plitzlik. Yeah.
Yeah.
just don't say it backwards, or you'll disappear. Well, I guess the thing is, we do need that goofball comic relief character. I mean, especially the weird one, and maybe need is a strong word, but they do like putting those goofball comic relief characters in anyway. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so since we are all of people of reasonable intelligence, let's discuss what intelligence is first. So
I just want to throw out, he came in 1944, so he was definitely before the Great Gazoo.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he would definitely be before.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So one was probably a ripoff of the other, but of course you didn't need to get Gazoo to say his name backwards to get rid of him.
No, absolutely not.
All right, so Don, what is intelligence?
That's a complicated issue. We were just talking about this before the show. I think if you're going to talk intelligence, because it's generally considered smarts, knowledge, ability to apply, I guess you'd say, intellectual power to tasks. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're going to talk how it's represented in culture and entertainment, you have to sort of break it down into two things. Mm-hmm. And that would be intelligence and wisdom. Again, keeping with our D&D cosmology here for such things.
Right.
And I think in the modern era right now, intelligence is generally considered like book knowledge. Mm-hmm. Like your ability to bring up fact, your ability to know trivia, your ability to say, to connect things up intellectually, like that's the old detective thing. Mm-hmm. Why, he had a left-handed cane and played baseball in 1988, so that must mean that kind of thing is intelligence. And wisdom, wisdom is kind of the idea of knowing how the world works. More the homespun kind of stuff, more practical knowledge.
Well, I would say this. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but, I was watching some YouTube videos earlier today, and I happened across one by Professor Jordan Peterson. Please don't turn off, folks. It's okay. And Professor Jordan Peterson, where someone asked him about memory. And he had an interesting point, which is basically memory is there to help us learn and avoid making the same mistakes over and over again. He had some much more erudite way of putting it, but basically that. And that's what I'd equate with wisdom, right? That we have memory so that we can learn from our past and so that we can hopefully make better choices in the future. That's the practical survival role it plays. And I'd say wisdom is part of that.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, before you mentioned that intelligence is the learning of something and wisdom is the application therefore of.
Okay.
So, and I was saying that because I was thinking about my dear ex-mother-in-law who was extremely smart when it came to intelligence. Like, she had a number of different degrees and worked as a pharmacist at the hospital. So she knew Latin and all that kinds of stuff like that. But if you put her out in a street, she was Marcus Brody. You know, like, is anybody here speak ancient Greeks? Ancient Greek? You know?
Right.
Or Rosicrucian. Like, it was just, she wouldn't know what to do with herself, right? So, you know, I think the application thereof is the wisdom and the intelligence. And let's be fair, like, what I love, too, about this topic is it fits so well with DNA because lately we've associated a lot of intelligence with geekiness. And so we should have a conversation at some point if that's earned or not.
Okay.
That's it. That's actually an interesting point. It's because the first thing I think of when you differentiate wisdom and intelligence is, you know, nerds or geeks, high intelligence, low wisdom.
Yeah.
Kind of. And that's why I think it's good Jack is here, because this does tie in with the episode we did a long time ago about nerds, about how there really aren't nerds anymore and how that happened.
I was there for that.
Yes, you were.
Dun, dun, dun!
Hyperlink here.
Yes, there we go. No, we'll include a hyperlink in the show notes. Yes.
No, it's already here in the audio. You don't need it in the show notes. Remember, I used to do audio hyperlinks. That was a while ago.
That's right. Audio hyperlinks. There we go. All right. So, well, why don't we play off of that then? Well, I mean, why save it for later? So, nerds, are they really smart? Or are they wise? What's the deal? Let's fight. Let's discuss.
Do you want? Here's my thought about it. I was reading an article about it, and they were saying, you know, why it was actually a thread somewhere, and they were saying, you know, why are nerds smart? And most people wrote they're not. You know, they just kept going all the way down that they're not smart. But I think the truth of the matter is that most nerds are outsiders, and outsiders, because they're not the big football or sports people, they've had a lot more time to try to be more introspective or read into other things. So they become book smart and not wisdom smart, but book smart for the reason that if they didn't do that, they'd go crazy because they've got nothing else for them, kind of thing.
Right.
In that respect, until they meet other nerds like that, and then they feed off of each other as to who has the best trivia for things and stuff like that. And that becomes like the fight of the nerds, right? Who's the smartest nerd of all, right? And so then you can have these kinds. There's actually a podcast, Geek versus Nerds, where they take like the most nerdiest of subjects. It's my old co-host Andrew Dorfman who created it, and they've got one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And they'll do things like who's the best pilot, Captain Reynolds, or oh my God, I just can't believe I blanked on or Han Solo. And when they did it live at one of the conventions, Nathan Fillion called in.
Oh my God!
So he had to win, right? It's like it wasn't going to have Harrison Ford call in to rap battle him for it. So, but that's what happens. Is I think the fact that you are on the fringes of the popularity, because you're outside of the circle in the party, you have to spend more time studying humanity in different ways.
Well, I think some of it also might be that many outsiders, as you put them, are just not good at social skills to begin with. They're often shy, introverts. They're just not good at dealing with other people. So as an end result, they spend a lot of time thinking about other people and trying to figure out how to interact, because it's almost a survival mechanism, really.
Well, is that a chicken and or egg situation? You're saying that they're they're not outgoing to begin with, but maybe they learned that, right? Maybe they weren't aggressive when they were really, really young, and because they weren't picked first, they didn't rebound quickly from being rejected. That's made them more and more introverted, as opposed to were they born introverted?
I would argue that it's a mix, like anything. I think some people are born introverted. I think there are people that are naturally shy. I can think of a few children that I've encountered, like really young children who are pathologically shy. And it's not something that, as far as I know, that they've learned, that they're usually very happy, loving, nurturing parents. They're not being put down or anything, but I've met a fair number of super shy kids that if you look at them wrong, they'll cry and run away. And I can only imagine what that is like when they actually enter school and as they get older. So there are definitely kids that are born introverts.
Well, but to be fair, and we're challenging here.
Right, of course.
But my nieces, 3 or 4 of them, were ridiculously shy, like we thought they had something wrong with them. But as they grew up, they grew out of that.
Yeah,
so,
that
like
can
my
happen,
youngest one, for example, is extremely shy and would just like curl away if she didn't want to hug anybody in the family or anything like that now. And now she is the most tough. She's like 1.5 feet shorter than everybody else on her team, but she's still tough as nails, the most outgoing person in the whole bit. So I'm not sure, because there is an element as you grow up of shyness, of they call it making strange, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
like every kid has to make strange at a certain age. The question is, do they rebound from that?
Yeah. Do they outgrow it or not? Yeah.
Or does that become a strategy for them? Or, like those kinds of things. And again, you're right. It probably is a mixture, but it's fascinating to see who does and who doesn't.
Yeah, that's true. I also keep in mind there's a fair number of people that are very high functioning autistics. So some of them literally they literally are not responding to social cues. They just don't have that sense. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is a beautiful example of that. And so as an end result, they're going to be shy or they're going to be outsiders, and they really have no choice in the matter. In fact, to them, human behavior is a little bit alien, that they're just trying to cope.
So are all autistic people intelligent?
No, definitely not. Some are. I've met a few autistics that were super intelligent, but I've also seen ones that are definitely not. We've got that Rain Man genius thing going on in society, but that's not always true by any means.
Yeah,
what was the show that he always wanted to watch? Rain Man?
He wanted to see Judge Wapner.
Game show.
No, it was a People's
Wapner.
Court.
Yeah.
People's
Court.
Judge Wapner. Love Judge Wapner.
Yeah, love Judge Wapner. That's right. Just a little aside there.
Yep.
So you guys have kind of hit on something that goes with the idea of intelligence and wisdom, because intelligence, depending on the era, it kind of bounces back and forth being the domain of the outsider or not.
Okay.
And this goes where when we were talking about nerds and where they came from and how they happened, it ties in because if you go back, like, say, immediately after World War II, the idea of intelligence, and especially intelligence as expressed as science and science expressed as technology, it was seen as a good thing. Like, technology got amped up from World War II. We won the war through technology. That was where you had that idea. You didn't have nerds. Intellectuals were always like the two-fisted scientist type kind of guy, and it was generally portrayed as heroic.
That's true.
Like we said, it wasn't really until the 50s and the 60s you started seeing intelligence become more the domain of the outsider, and I think it's again because society became kind of more stabilized. And when you had the development of the youth market, when they invented teenagers, you had a lot of, especially entertainment, geared towards that audience because they had disposable income. And you started to see kind of the emotional taken up. The intellectual took a backseat because, again, teenagers are just full of raging hormones, and they don't typically, intellectualizing things was seen as like school stuff.
Don't I know it?
Yeah. And then, and that's where you saw this idea of intelligence becoming an outsider thing again, because it was the bookworm. Wisdom becomes the thing. It's intelligence for the insider.
Mm-hmm.
And that was why you would typically see, like, wisdom comes from, like your grandpa who's been around and he's seen a few things and he knows what's what. Or it comes from, like, the street smart guy. Or when you get into like, the advent of youth culture and, say, the 60s and that, wisdom starts being associated with another stat, charisma, because wisdom is seen as the ability to deal with people, to express an idea to people, to motivate people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, you start seeing that because when you get to the 60s going into the 70s, you had a lot of social movements. And social movements are based on more of a collective, more of bringing people together, and more of an emotion than any kind of, like, intellectualization.
Now, wouldn't you say that, sorry to throw in, Don, but wouldn't you say that then a professor would typify somebody who's intelligent, a guru might typify somebody who's wise that way?
You can do that. I think the use of the terms that you've used, that role is a constant, but it changes.
Yeah.
Like for guru, you typically go mentor.
Mm-hmm.
That everybody has an Obi-Wan. Like you'll see the more experienced person handing down the useful information to like the impetuous youth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It could be motivational speaker too, as it comes through the years. You know.
Yeah.
It takes different forms in that way. Yeah.
True.
And it's given different credibility because I think what you saw again when you get into the 80s going into the 90s, that was the era of like hug a nerd. Mm-hmm. And I think it's again because technology is starting to be seen as a driving force in society and a positive one. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you get to the 70s, there was that kind of like back to nature sort of idea, getting out of the city, getting into your own head, like turning your back on the Madison Avenue plastic fantastic thing, man. But in the 80s, that kind of comes back. And that's why, because intellect had been shunted to the outsider starts becoming the insider, and you get the hug a nerd thing because smart people are seen as okay.
Because they're making money.
Yeah, and that's part of it. But they're making money because they have the skills that society has started valuing again.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Especially when you get into like the microcomputer thing, that's seen as the bastion of the intellect. But while we don't have the two-fisted scientist hero guy, you sort of see it come back. You get like Indiana Jones, and there's a couple other similar characters that they try to establish.
Doc Savage.
Yep.
Well, that was a 70s thing. Wasn't that like 77, 76, 77 they did the movie?
Yeah.
But you're right.
Coming up with a new one too.
Yeah,
you're
there's
right,
a new one coming. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the early 80s, the books did come back.
Mm-hmm.
And again,
so here,
go ahead.
I want to bring something on your point. I'm asking a question because you guys would know this better than I would. Because you bring up Don, and I think you have a good point that there's various different sort of generations or ages that intelligence takes different forms as to what kind of value we have, whether we value the more wise person, more intelligent person, the whole bit. But that's generally North America, or at least because that's what we're talking about. It's like the culture, right?
Yeah.
So here's my question for you guys. If you take a look at things like Japan, which had its blooming of various different kinds of intelligences too, and you talked about some of those in like the science shows, like the science hero shows and stuff like that, were those echoes to what happened first in North America? Are they following their own kind of trends, or are they looking towards? Is this something that's happening globally, but it's coming in various different sort of like pebbles on the pond kind of thing, with the echoes going outwards, and it starts in one place and moves outwards, or is it totally independent based upon the culture?
I think that would be up for me. Asia is a bit different because, of course, you've got to remember they have Confucianism. And Confucianism places great emphasis on the intellect and the intellectual and listening to wise people and such, okay? Mm-hmm. And respecting your elders and respecting wisdom. And they have all these different rules about of what skills a good man should have and what a proper man should be like. But they place a great emphasis, of course, on intelligence. That's there. And that has had huge influence on all Asian cultures. Again, East Asian cultures, of course. India is a little bit different. But if we're talking Vietnam, even the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, doesn't matter. So we've got that. Plus, you've got that interesting situation with Asia as well, where remember in the second half of the 19th century, Asia was still relatively primitive. I mean, I don't want to throw too many stones, but they were. Japan was closed off from the world. China was kind of like sunk down in a funk. I mean, things were not going so well for Asia at that point. It was a low point in their history for various reasons. And then what happens is suddenly the Westerners show up with their technology and their intellectual knowledge and their much more advanced knowledge in many cases. And they basically kick all their asses, like majorly, totally, completely, and utterly. And they force Japan to open up. They conquer China. They open Asia up. And as an end result, the Asians get a little bit of a future shock where they basically go, holy crap, the world is advanced without us. If we don't advance, we are in deep doggy doo-doo. So at that point, they freak out. The Japanese begin a mass focus on modernization. A few other Asian countries try to as well, with varying degrees of success. The Chinese are kind of resistant to it, even though they really should have, but whatever. But regardless, so there's this idea then that Asian cultures came to revere, especially, they already revered wisdom already, but then suddenly it literally became survival in the way of the future. They went through this culture thing in the late 19th century. So as an end result, they revere intelligence, they always have, and they probably always will. And this is just, again, a result of both history and experience, so they're quite different. And I think all cultures have revered intelligence to one degree or another, but the Asians have kind of taken it to a whole new level, which they do with many things. But they're not alone. I mean, think about this. I mean, the Germans have had great admiration and respect for intelligence for a very long time. Even when they were a whole bunch of little countries and that, they actually placed great emphasis on intelligence and learning. So did many European cultures and countries. I mean, the Germans are not alone that way. And other cultures around the world have also placed great emphasis on learning and intelligence. At one point, the Middle East was the great center of learning and intelligence as well. Sorry, I'm taking us really far back into history, but I think one thing I want to bring up was just that culturally, there was actually a great value placed on intelligence throughout most of human history. Partly because, remember, they didn't have the internet, and for most of human history, they didn't even have books. So people who could come up with stuff and were creative were incredibly valued members of society. The wise, the old people that had survived and had wisdom to pass on, that was survival knowledge. That was incredibly valuable. It wasn't until we got to the 20th century where that got kind of thrown out of kilter, I'd say.
Yeah, I think there's a catch, too, with that, that ties into the difference between intelligence and wisdom, that there's also kind of a nostalgic effect. Mm-hmm. And that affects what we consider worth knowing. Mm. And you can see that because when you get to, say, in North America post-World War II, like immediately post-World War II, there's this vision of the future, industry, technology, blah, blah. We've all seen the educational films. And the idea of somebody who follows the old ways, like, say, a farmer, or the smaller towns and that, they become rubes. That becomes the idea that they're trapped in the past.
That's true.
And that kind of knowledge is no longer valued in that era. But then you go a generation up and you see it come back, partly because of nostalgia, because, again, everybody's, I remember the good old days when you could sit in your porch drinking your lemonade and times were easier and simpler and we knew where you stood then. And what you get is that kind of old-timey homespun intelligence comes back and is labeled as wisdom, and that makes it acceptable again.
Ooh, this brings another question then. So does intelligence, the effective use of intelligence in a society and or wisdom, because one can argue, one is larger than another or more emphasized than another in certain times, is that reliant upon myth?
I think it might be partly, and it might again be practicality, because going back to the idea of, say, Japan's always been a weird country because while they've almost always strived to hypermodernize, they always hang on to the old way old, like, cultural ideals and roots, and you get this weird mix. Whereas in the West, we kind of tend to vacillate. And part of the problem that you get with say, that question of does it depend on myth, is how we define intelligence and what we value tends to focus on results. And results tend to be practical, but then they also have kind of, I guess, like a whimsical, mythological aspect to them as well.
It's funny though, because we talk the application of intelligence is wisdom, but wisdom itself may not be practical. Wisdom itself, you know, like if you take a look at some of the great things, like Rob was bringing up Confucius, but there's Lao Tzu, and there's a ton of others that came at almost the exact same time as this explosion of wisdom traditions that may, you know, they don't help you really sow the fields. They don't really help you harvest rice. You know, those are really intelligent things that you need to do, but they do help you live your life more fully. And that's not a practical aspect as well. And when I want to go back to the whole myth idea, because a lot of people forget that so much of the American go-get-it kind of attitude, that's part of mythology that was developed in the 19th century, this sort of new Adam idea that came from the existentialists, you know, the Ralph Waldo Emersons and the Walt Whitmans of this. You can leave everything that you were behind and spring anew in America and make anything that you want of yourself. And that it was this sort of, we will always progress forward, which continued moving into the 50s, which got them onto the moon, right? This idea that the can-do effort of America. And that myth starts to break down, and maybe that myth breaks down in the face of consumerism and modern day, you know, we could sell you anything, therefore the ideologies that we have developed, the myths that we developed before, have lost their flavor in that respect.
It could be, because we get new myths, and again, I think it ties into that you might hit upon the idea too that wisdom helps ground you, because I'm thinking you've got like the post-war go-get-em vision of the future kind of thing, and going into like the 60s, you see a brand new myth emerge that becomes commonplace, especially in America, and that would be Andy Griffith. Yep. and if Ross is listening, I sincerely apologize for that. But yeah, you have this idea that if you remember, like the Andy Griffith show, he was just this common, down to earth, old timey, old fashioned, not hurried, not up with like, you know, the modern headaches kind of guy, and yet that character would come back, and you would constantly see that character frustrate like the opponents that represented the modern era, the modern fixation, the drive for technology, and that became
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, another good example. Or Will Rogers, the philosopher guy who, you know, used his lasso and talked a whole bunch of, you know, homespun stuff.
That's Will Rogers.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, but that's it, and I think that's this idea that became one of the new myths, and even though people didn't know it, and it's sort of like I say, I think it grounds you and it gives you an out, because part of the problem, and one of the reasons why I think you see these weird anti-intellectual bends pop up in North America so often, is being smart takes some effort. And it can get overwhelming at times, especially if what's considered smart is something you're not really integrated into.
Right.
Like if you go back to the 80s, at the beginning of the Hug a Nerd thing, you had the microcomputing thing. And most people didn't really understand it. They had a vague awareness of computers. By the middle of the decade, going into the end, you had people buying home computers, but they were basically using them as like word processors and really expensive calculators to do like their taxes and stuff.
Pretty much, yeah.
But the idea of the person who could manipulate the computer and actually do things, like that was still this weird, almost shamanistic figure. And I think,
Yes,
again,
it was. Yeah.
yeah, and that's where you get, like, say, movies like Tron. The original Tron comes out and people, like, watch it, and yeah, it's about magic glowing elves that make your computer work, and everybody digs that and makes perfect sense. And then in, like, the 2000 and teens, when you remake it, it doesn't really go over because everybody now knows how a computer works. So the idea of magical elves living inside of it that make it run, it's way too fantastical. It's not... It's like Chad said, when you see they're in a nightclub, is that an iPod? Like, what is... We can relate the computer to things now. Like, we know how it works. So how does that work? What is that?
Right. Actually,
it's like Reboot, too.
Yeah. Reboot's a continuation of that, really,
Yeah.
Actually, I want to take things a step further in what you were talking about, Don. Okay, let's talk about thinking fast and slow.
Okay.
All right. So, I don't know, Jack, have you read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman?
No, but I did. Did you? Is it similar to what they were talking about at Mysterious Universe with the book called, like, Rabbit Brain, Tortoise Brain?
It's probably exactly the same thing, except Daniel Kahneman, I think it's Kahneman actually, is he's the one who did the actual research that's probably based on, and he wrote his own book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Cool. The short version is this: back in, I believe it was the 1960s, although Don can correct me on that, Daniel Kahneman and his fellow researchers accidentally discovered something, which is that our pupils dilate depending on how much brain power we're using. So your eyes are literally effort meters. They literally will show how much effort you're putting into something. And you can literally see from the second it starts to the second it finishes how much effort your brain is putting into something based on your pupils and how they dilate. All right. So they discovered that, and so they thought, okay, well, let's use this to start exploring different aspects of human psychology. And what they discovered is, and this, again, Kahneman points out, this is a huge simplification. Okay, this goes back to what you were just saying about tortoise brain, rabbit brain. Although what they refer to it as System 1 and System 2, because they're science nerds, and, that's what they like calling things. Nerds. Anyway, so the key point is this. System 1 is your basic intuitive system. It's your everyday, average operating normal level of function, basically. It's how your brain normally functions. Okay, it's a normal level of effort that you put in. It's very comfortable. It's very low level, and it's more based on things like intuition and gut feelings, and it's just how you remember to breathe and everything else. Okay, and that's what
when that leaf rushes in front of your face, the fact that your hand comes up to protect yourself, whether it really needs protecting or not, is part of that intuitive.
Yep, exactly. That's System 1. Yep, exactly. Yep. And then this contrasts with System 2, which is basically when you're putting your effort into something. This is the things that require actual measured effortful thought, as he puts it. If you want to see someone go from System 1 to System 2, he has a great example in his book. He has a bunch of them, but this is the one that's always stuck with me. Is okay. So if you're walking with someone, okay, ask them a complicated question. Like, ask what's 234 times 562 or something like that, okay? They will immediately stop walking. That's the first thing that they will do. And why? It's because their System 2 is just kicked in, it's attempting to solve the problem, and it's basically using all the brain's processing power, and so they can't even walk at that point. It's literally using that much effort. All right, so this is the whole System 1, System 2 thing. And I've tried it. It actually does work. It really will work. It's a fun party game you can play.
What's interesting with the rabbit brain, tortoise brain, though, is they have a third one. That's what the book is about. It's the third
Interesting.
one.
Mm-hmm.
So they talk about, like the intuitive one. Then they talk, I think I forget what they call it. It's like alpha brain or something they call it for that. And that's the one where it takes a lot of thought process. And they said what's really fascinating, and they have a lot of studies based on this, is that there's a third way of knowing, which is letting it go and letting your brain come up with the answer by not thinking on it. Right, and you can actually be more successful not thinking at all and have something. So it's like that time when you have a problem, you go to sleep and you wake up and you have the answer. or you're singing in the shower and you're like, oh, yes, that's it. Or you put stuff together that you didn't put together for. So it's really frustrating because it actually means the less you know, sometimes the better it is.
Well, not always. Because
sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. Okay, so and I could see that actually. There's a kind of back end processing that's going on as well. Because again, he's mostly referring to conscious thought, and mostly conscious thought, whereas what you're talking about is basically the unconscious part of the brain, which of course is most of it, really.
Sure.
But anyway, the point is, and this is how it relates to what we're talking about, is so one of the things they've discovered is by measuring this is they discovered a couple things. First, people hate using System 2. Human beings are really, really lazy. So we will do everything in our power to avoid using System 2 whenever possible. Okay? So we love making gut feelings or gut choices and things like that. Why? Because it means we don't have to put any effort into it. Human beings are just astoundingly lazy creatures. We basically exist in System 1, and we do our best to avoid using System 2.
My gut instinct is to trust you on that.
Okay, yep, there we go. Your System 1 is a wise System 1, Jack. But the other thing that they've discovered, of course, is that our brains are like muscles, okay? So you can actually make your System 1 stronger and more capable of a variety of thought over time by, reading and using your brain, etc. And, of course, your System 2 can actually become stronger as well. In fact, the more you use it, the stronger it gets. But conversely, the less you use it, the weaker it gets. So what you'll get is you'll get people that literally for them to try to use System 2 is almost painful. It literally is a kind of mental pain to have to try to use their System 2 to use their advanced processes. So they avoid it as
Homer
best
Simpson
possible.
is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, I got to use my brain again.
That's my second
brain.
favorite.
I don't like you and you don't like me, so let's get through this so I can start killing you with beer.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Agreed. That's System 1 and System 2 in action. There we go. There they are. There they are right there. Working together as a team.
That's cool.
So one of the things that I've noticed, this is my own observation, not Kahneman's, is, again, we love not using System 2, okay? And in a weird way, we actually celebrate it. Think about this. We tend to celebrate in our pop culture people who make the right gut choices and everything. Oh, I'm following my gut. I'm doing what comes naturally, that kind of thing. That's all System 1 stuff.
Yeah.
So Donald Trump.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Donald Trump, George W. Bush. Actually,
I go with my gut. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But not just him. I mean, every 80s action character.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, most characters on cop shows. Most cowboys.
Yeah.
Hell, most detectives.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, Sherlock Holmes is actually almost weird that way, where he actually is someone who uses his brain as opposed to just going with his gut feeling that tells him to go in the right direction.
Yeah, but you gotta remember, this ties in with what we started with. If you look at, say, the new Sherlock Holmes, like any version of them, he's portrayed as a weirdo.
Yes, he is. Yeah,
and I think.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say, though, I think the fact that the heroes tend to use System 1, the villains tend to use System 2. Because if you think about it, the ones that are the villains tend to be English and or evil geniuses. And usually both, right? So, but think about it, like James Moriarty, we were talking about Sherlock Holmes. Totally a System 2 person. He's so meticulous in all his planning. Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, Cersei Lannister, Hannibal Lecter,
Lex Luthor,
the Duns from Gone Girl, Nick and Amy, Griffin from The Invisible Man. All of those people, they tend to really plot and plan, and maybe we're afraid of that. We're afraid of the people who are so good at System 2 that they're fooling us.
Yeah, well, because we are afraid of the people that are smarter than us. There's an actual fear there, and I think a lot of pop culture plays on that. That's one of the reasons why every superhero, if you think about it, their main villain is always a smart guy.
Yes.
Yeah, usually, yeah.
There are a couple different, I think, practical reasons for that. One is they're a smart guy because that way they can come up with cool and interesting plots that the hero then has to undo, right? So there's some of that. Some of it's just, it's a requirement for the job. I mean, if they're not, then they're just an unthinking brute who's destroying stuff, and those characters exist too, but they don't make good arch villains.
But they tend to be smart guys without powers too.
Yes, that's
right?
their main power.
So, like Lex Luthor, his power is his intelligence. He comes up with technology for that. Same with Joker, right? His evil intelligence is what makes him do stuff. It's not like he has Mr. Cold or Captain Cold's or ability.
Right.
So it is those. To be
Mr.
fair,
Freeze.
Mr. Freeze, but there's a Captain Cold. That's from
that's the Flash's villain. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. Mr. Freeze is intelligent too, but he's coldly intelligent in that respect. But it's more innate in that respect because he's a tragic character, right?
Yeah.
In that respect, so it's slightly different in that way. But I think it's interesting because if you contrast that with like Sliders, remember that episode Eggheads?
I didn't watch Sliders, so I can't really say.
Okay, it's the very first season. Like it goes really off the rails quickly. I tried to watch it on Netflix because I thought I got to see the entire series of Sliders. And about 2 seasons in, I was like, I've got to stop this while I still can, and I did. It was one of my greatest accomplishments. But
Okay.
in one of the Sliders episodes, you know the theory. Like they go from parallel world to parallel world.
Yeah.
They actually go to a world where intelligence takes precedence over athletics. And so all the great like sports heroes play this sport called mind game, where they're all dressed up as if they're ready to do sports stuff, but it takes a lot of intelligence to do it. So all the commercials, all the sports people get all the money from various different companies because of how intelligent they are. And so it just sort of highlights what we value instead. We value system one, where we want that person to make snap decisions on the court, be able to be a leader, be able to instantaneously know what needs to be done, as opposed to really reasoning it out and coming up with the best way. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we're so afraid of our robot overlords.
Possibly. By the way, the society you just described, that's called South Korea.
Oh, wow.
South Korea is where where they have e-athletes, for example.
Wow.
And intellectual pursuits are highly valued in Korean society. Everyone has to be master playing Go and chess and piano.
How long has that been?
That's been for a little while. Korea, like Japan, is a resource-poor country, so their only resource is their people.
Gotcha.
So, as an end result, that's where they put their emphasis, because there was a certain point where manufacturing wasn't going to get them anywhere. So they're like, well, we need to encourage the next generation to be much smarter so they can figure out a way to solve this problem.
Cool.
Right.
Now, Korean culture has always valued intelligence, but in the last maybe 30, 40 years, there's definitely been a huge push for it. The wars of the mid-20th century kind of weeded the population out a little bit, so that was a bit of an issue. And in China, remember, during the Cultural Revolutions, they burned all the intellectuals. Or, correction, they sent them to labor camps where they basically worked them to death. They didn't burn them. I apologize. That was... I'm trying to remember which country that was.
I think that was a few.
Yeah, there's been a few where they've done that, but burn the witch. Anyway.
Yeah, basically.
But we've always had that idea. But that goes back to what I was saying, where the Asians, for many reasons, value intelligence on a cultural level that we don't. And that's something I've always loved about Asian culture. It has its downsides, but one of my beloved parts of that about Asian culture is that they have great value for intelligence. Yeah, so there we go. So there's South Korea. There's your culture where they literally do have what we would call, gamer nerds. They have them actually doing commercials for products on the air and everything like that.
Okay, so here's my question for you. So in South Korean culture and their media, are their supervillains really, really smart, just like everybody else?
Yes.
Or are the heroes equally as smart?
Yes.
So it's System 2 versus System 2.
Usually, yes. I mean, the hero will be a little here, and this is something we can get into. There will be a little more balance. So the hero will be smart, but the hero will usually also have some other smart people backing them up, and so they'll usually win because they're all putting their brains together versus the villain who is evil and selfish and is just doing it. They're basically the one really smart person versus a group of other people that are maybe not quite as smart but are working together as a team. That's what you'll see in Asian stuff usually. Because they do still worry that if they make their hero too smart, A, he or she will be really hard to write, and B, he or she will also kind of alienate the audience a little bit. Because, for all I'm saying about Asians valuing smarts, there are still tons of stupid people in Asia, okay? The audience, most people everywhere in the world, including Asia, still run on System 1. They really don't want to use their System 2 any more than they have to.
Well, here's a question then. Is it an evolutionary trait to run very well on System 1 because it takes less effort?
It probably is, actually. People who are better with System 1 probably do actually do better in life.
Well, I think, though, what you're seeing, and this ties in with say, South Korea, is, again, environment effects, because we live in an environment, because of technology and where it's at and how quickly it develops. Intellect is valued. Intellect is useful. Because you see here in North America, we keep trying to make that switch. Because you're always hearing people talking about, we must train the kids for the high-tech jobs of the future. And it's
future.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like that old 50s rhetoric. But we can never quite get any traction on it because we don't really know what that means. And there's kind of this weird undercurrent that for a while we really didn't value intellect overall. So you kind of start seeing, like, say, politicians will talk about, we have to get the kids ready for the future. They need high-tech skills. They need education. They need intellectual agility. So we're going to cut the educational budget in half and then use that as a tax cut for the pharmaceuticals and to buy more tanks. Well, okay, your heart might be in the right place, but you're not. We don't know how to do things that would actually exemplate intellect, and I think this is one of the reasons why you'll see, like right now when we're recording, there's the whole big thing going on about Facebook, about them jacking your info and selling it. And we've heard about this before, and we know about the dark web, where people steal your identity like an alien in a 50s horror movie. And that kind of keeps feeding in this weird undercurrent that we value technology, but we're still terrified of it. And it, again, undercuts us making that shift to a more positive view of intellect. Like, going back to what we were talking about with, like, Sherlock Holmes and that, the intelligent person is still seen as an oddity. And I think, again, that's why, like Jack had brought up way at the beginning of this, the idea that certain things like, say, autism are typically portrayed as magic. Like, an autistic person doesn't have a problem. They have some magical gift that lets them see the world differently, and then they can be a teenage doctor or like a theoretical particle physicist and that. And the downside just becomes, like, interesting personality quirks.
Right. It's interesting, actually, you brought that up, because there's a show called The Good Doctor on right now about this autistic super genius doctor kid.
Yep.
Who's like teenager, which is just Doogie Howser, except Doogie Howser wasn't autistic. He was just a genius.
Yeah, and if you think back to, say, Doogie Howser, and the progenitor of Doogie Howser and his ilk from that era would be Ferris Bueller, like, Doogie was still portrayed as a wacky, semi-hip, just nerdy enough to be entertaining kind of teenager. Like,
yeah.
And again, the intellectual parts of that show kind of got backpedaled because they would do things like, he stayed out late and mom and dad grounded him. And you're like, he does open heart surgery. Why doesn't he have power of attorney? Like, and again, it's because they were kind of just splitting the difference. It's the wacky teen show with the interesting twist that he's this super genius doctor, but he still can't talk to a girl and can't figure out how to drive because, again, it's that weird magical mental thing that he can be intellectual. He's a brilliant doctor, but there's still that downside. He still lacks wisdom. He doesn't know the real things, the down-to-earth kind of things.
Which makes the audience feel good about themselves because they know about that stuff, but he doesn't. So it's all okay.
Yeah.
Weil E. Hauser, super genius.
Well, basically,
it's funny that you're talking about Sherlock Holmes, though, because when I think about the Sherlock Holmes that's shown in the British series, he is a mixture of System 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Because he instinctively sees things that he almost can't process, and things come out of it, right?
Yeah.
So you'll see him pick things up off the wall, and his brain is putting it together instantaneously, and he's like, whoa, oh, cool. But it's that instinct that something is wrong, and he's still figuring out why it's wrong. Not that he's learned something that's necessarily that's going to, fix him out of it. He's not MacGyver.
Yeah.
Right? He's taking stuff that is that is totally not connected to anything else, and putting it together instantly through instinct and learning.
Yeah.
It's very weird. So,
well, there's a catch to that too, because what you were talking about, the type 3 way of thinking that the one book there has, that ties in with something that, say, me and Rob talked about decades ago. And it's why, say, most comic books and role-playing games and movies really suck. And it's that idea that I've always said, if you want to be like any kind of an artist or writer or that, you have to put in the work on learning theory. You have to learn, okay, not just what works. Don't just read Save the Cat and then mouth typewriter fart out whatever, the formula he used in that book was. You want that idea. You want a lot of that theory in your head. Same thing, too, we talked a long time ago. If you want to write science fiction, stop reading science fiction. Because all that shit's already in your head. You put more things in there because your subconscious brain will still parse through problems in that. And if you've got more of these things, more of this theory, more of these templates wigging around in your head, your subconscious can draw more of that into the into dealing with the problem.
right.
And I find that's one of the things that for a long time society doesn't value, because society doesn't want intellectuals and creative types. It wants people who can fix your computer or your car. So there tends to be this focus on specialization.
That's true.
I find, especially in entertainment, like that's one of the reasons why if you read a modern superhero comic, most of them are really boring, because the people writing them are the people that grew up reading superhero comics in the 90s, and the superhero comics of the 90s were written by the people who grew up reading the superhero comics from the 80s. Nobody's added anything to that formula or those ideas for a very, very long time, so you're basically just getting weird, stripped-down regurgitations.
Yeah, that's a problem. Sorry, Jack.
You
go.
brought up comics, so I want to bring up something that I was thinking about while you guys were talking about this, because we want to go back. I'm going backwards to the idea of intelligence versus wisdom. And I would argue Batman is intelligent. Superman may be considered intelligent and wise at the same time. But it's his wisdom that people respect more. But it's also the same thing that makes him a putz. And it's the same thing that Captain America has, right? Captain America has wisdom more than, he has, sure, you can say he's got a kind of like combat intelligence, but he's not like a super smart guy. It's really his understanding of humanity that people love so much, right? And again, it's what makes him a putz, right? So maybe there's a certain element that happens in comics that, if you're the kind of person that appreciates wisdom and gurus and that kind of thing, there comes with a kind of anti-baggage against that, in the same level that if you're somebody who really loves intelligent people, there's an anti-intelligence backlash as well that's happening in society as too. It's just different tribes, right, that are fighting for dominance.
Well, I think you've hit upon a couple things there too, that because when I was originally making my notes for this, I added a third part of the D&D cosmology. I added charisma. Because what you're getting at, and I think this is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for anybody to do a Superman movie that really takes off with the audience, that you're right that Superman is more, he's wisdom, he's understanding, he's warmth. Like that's what
he's
like,
supposed to be.
I've always pictured that Superman proper, he's supposed to be like your good-natured big brother.
Yeah.
He looks out for you. He cares about you. He's more like worldly than you are. He can do more than you can, but he never holds that against you, kind of thing. And I think that's tough to write because, again, intellect is sort of, it's seen as weird. It's seen as, like, the outsider. That's why, like, Batman is intellect, and that's why he's this cold, sociopathic kind of guy, and especially in the movies. He's not the 1950s fun-loving Batman that you'd see hanging out with Robin in inappropriate ways in the cover of the comics. He's like the Dark Knight guy. Because
yeah, but I would actually make the argument, and I know where this is going to go with Jack, I would make the argument that the Batman that we've seen in the movies, especially the Dark Knight trilogy and that, isn't intellectual at all. He's actually just a brute force character. He really has no subtlety, no intellect. He just kind of brute forces his way through everything.
No, you're absolutely right. He's not the world's greatest detective.
No,
yeah.
but he's
which
still...
is what they used to call him as.
They used to call
in the 70s. Right?
In fact, almost no Batman in the film, live action film, has ever been the world's greatest detective. They always just turn him into an action hero.
I'll challenge you with only one film, and we'll all laugh at this, but it's probably the closest one to the comics of him as the world's greatest detective, and that's the Batman movie from the 1960s. Because he actually figures stuff out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that ridiculous when you think about it? He happens
Batman
to be the
Yeah.
smartest Batman of all. Is Adam West?
Yeah, that's...
Because he's the only one who's actually functioning as a detective. The other guys are all just like a psycho guy in a costume who beats up mentally ill people.
Yeah, like, exactly. They're figuring out all the clues left by the Riddler. They're coming up with shark repellent.
Right.
Trying to find a place to dispose of a bomb.
That's right. All those things.
Yep. Whereas, for some reason, they feel obligated to dumb down Batman. And I guess, again, that's partly to appeal to a mass audience. I think that the mass audience doesn't want heroes that are that much smarter than them or that they can't follow.
Yeah, but there's a catch because they still dress it up like he's supposed to be a smart guy.
No, they always pretend they are, but they never really are.
Yeah, but
I think it's different than that, though, Rob. I think people look at System 1 specialists and see them as mystical and see them as greater than, because they're not using book smarts. They have some sort of inherent powers that none of us could get, and that's what makes them alpha men. That's what makes them so great to be leaders, is because they don't have to go back and look up something before they make a decision that will save all our lives.
They just know it automatically. They don't have to even use it.
They just know automatically,
yeah,
right?
They don't have to use
so it's
System
almost mystical thinking that way.
Okay.
And there's also another big problem when you talk about entertainment is that the smartest character in a story can only be as smart as the person writing the story.
There it is. There's the biggest problem, which is why it's very rare that you'll get very smart characters in media, because the truth is, while scriptwriters are usually smart people, they're usually not smart in the same way the character is supposed to be smart.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, it's like for somebody like me who like my favorite kinds of mysteries are, the ones that are like the really interesting whodunits, which require a lot of clues that you could put together if you wanted to. Those are really hard to write.
Yeah,
like to write well, to get to a point that you actually fool most of the audience until the end, and then they look back and go, "Why didn't I see this at the beginning?" That's like so hard to do.
Yeah.
Yep, it is.
I think I've only ever really seen one story where the characters were supposed to be really intelligent, and they actually acted really intelligent. And
Which
that was Death Note.
Oh, yeah. Death Note, they do, yeah.
I thought you were going to say Michael Caine without a clue.
No, actually, when you talk about this kind of thing, I always think of the old Tiny Toons when they did their Sherlock Holmes parody. Because there's a scene in that any kind of investigative show has, and it was the one, wait, a clue. It's lint. Lint rhymes with squint, which is what you do in a Clint Eastwood movie, which means they're at the museum. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
How about
that's usually
Peter?
how it goes.
Peter Sellers being there.
Oh.
There's a perfect example of somebody who is an ultimate System 1 person.
Right.
Because there is no intelligence there.
There's none.
And yet he
Yeah.
walks on water in the end. He's Jesus, right?
Right.
So, Can you think of anybody who's better at System 1 than Peter Sellers' character? I forget what his name was. Chauncey Gardner.
Okay. I'm trying to think.
Do you ever see that movie? No?
I haven't actually seen it, no. Sorry.
Oh, you have to watch the movie. It's one of my father's favorites. My father really likes comedy that's understated. And it is Peter Sellers. And what happens is that Peter Sellers plays this sort of very slow gardener by naming Chance the gardener. And the guy who paid for his life, the person who was really wealthy that gave him a job, really liked him, but dies. And so when he dies, he leaves him, stuff so he has enough money. And people start noticing him, and the simple things he says sound brilliant. So they decide that he's going to be like their next political find, right?
Right.
And so they'll say, what should we do with the Chinese problem? And his answers always have to, well, you must prune where you're needed to prune, Right. It's like, oh, so what you're saying is non-interference is the best way to deal with the China problem. Only prune it if you have to, right? And he's talking about gardening. So,
right, yeah.
And yeah, you have to watch. It's very cleverly done. So.
Wow, okay. It's
Shirley
called
MacLaine
Being There.
isn't. It's called Being There. Shirley MacLaine and Peter Sellers, and 1979 it came out.
I've heard of it. I've just never seen it.
It's a Hal Ashby movie, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
I will put it in the show notes, or at least an IMDb link, obviously. And
it's even got Jack Warden in it. I love Jack Warden as an actor. He's so much fun. So. Anyway.
It's not because he has almost the same name as you?
No, it's not that. It's because he was in a Twilight Zone, let's be honest.
Okay, well.
There we go.
That'll do it. But yeah, going back to Don's point, though, yeah, I mean, you can only write as smart as you actually are. And that's a big problem because many, especially screenwriters I've noticed, tend to be jacks of all trades, which means they're good at kind of faking almost everything, but they're not actually that great in any one area or any one thing. And so they can, so they do all sorts of cheats and tricks to say, they'll say the characters are smart, but they're really not that smart because the person writing them isn't either.
Unless they're the Grissams of the world, and they're just lawyers that will write law books.
That's different,
right?
though. I specifically said screenwriters because what you'll get is where you're getting people who quote unquote write what they know, as the famous writer advice goes. So you'll get John Grisham, you'll get Michael Crichton, you'll get people who are literally they're hyper specialist in one area, and so their stuff is really intelligent. Dan Brown. Their stuff is just filled with book smarts and sometimes even wisdom, in fact. Another one that is, it's the guy who does Jack Reacher. I'm trying to remember. The Jack Reacher books, which are Lee Child, are also, for what they are really well written and really intelligent. Reacher is an incredibly intelligent character. He's far more intelligent than most of the readers are.
Yes, that's true.
And that's the point is that so you'll get novelists can show that kind of intelligence, but as soon as you try to bring it to a mass audience, you've got to filter it through the screenwriter, and you've also got a whole Hollywood machine that is basically oriented towards dumbing it down because they're looking for the lowest common denominator because they don't want to alienate the audience.
Yeah. Well, there's the problem too that I think screenwriting is one, but there's a lot of different things that in the last, say, 30 years, these things have become careers, and there's bodies of thought, and there's schools, and there's places where you learn and I'm doing the air quote thing, right way of doing whatever it is you produce. And as I've always said, I've always felt that was a bad idea because everything starts looking the same because everybody's drawing from that same template of how to do it. And especially if you get screenwriting, like again, Save the Cat drives me nuts because people just start following that. It becomes the template. If you don't follow it, then it's considered not good, even by the audience, because the audience get used to that timing. You get stuck. You can't really do anything different. You get people that are moving into this job as a job. So, like I said, the comic book thing is one of the obvious ones. Because, again, these were people that their goal was to do comic books and to do comic books like the ones they enjoyed, which is cool. But if you were strictly a comic book guy, you're not bringing anything new to the mix.
Yeah. You don't have any life experience. You don't have any wisdom, which is not always true. Some comic book guys do actually bring in life experience or bring in other things. But if you start when you're in your 20s, yeah, that's where we run into a problem because you don't have a lot to offer usually at that point.
Well,
not new.
You can, but again, it is that idea that you're not getting a lot of different perspectives because what's happening, it's like comic books being done by the last generation of fan. People writing screenplays after going to like screenwriting school, they're drawing from the same well, and it starts to look really obvious that they're drawing from the same well at a point because again, nobody's done anything different enough to add to that mix. You're not getting any kind of new flavoring. You're getting refinements of the old stuff. You're getting things done better, but they're still just the same things.
Right. I'm sorry, go, Jack.
I was just gonna, here's a question that's sort of tangential of this because I'm wondering if really smart characters that they create in kids shows are they designed to inspire more intelligence from our youth, or are they just seen as anomalies and weird? Like, if you think of things like Jimmy Neutron or Mr. Peabody or Meet the Robinsons or, all those ones which are supposed to be like super intelligent people, is it just kitschy that they make them super intelligent? Or is that some sort of attempt to try to embolden society to make the next generation find intelligence cool? System 2 stuff.
It's tricky because, again, it depends. Usually the intellectual, again, is like the weirdo. And it's that idea of coming to terms with their weirdosity, which I guess is a fine message if, like, you're a smart guy struggling with it. But to a lot of the people watching, and I think this applies to, like, grown-up stuff as well, they're not going to see themselves as, like, the intellectual person. They might associate sort of with them, but it's going to be the secondary character that's usually the cool guy that is the one that's going to be that's going to be kind of their identifier character because they're going to look at the other characters through that lens, and that's how they're going to be portrayed.
I mean, it does depend though. I mean, for example, going back to our favorite Star Trek, the original series, and that one could argue that Spock was actually far more popular than Kirk was. But he was a product of the 60s when there was some, when we were putting men on the moon and everything, right? So there was there was some pro-intellectual movement going on at that point. That's true. The smart characters in stories. I think we as a society want to encourage people. Especially, we as a society, we as a society want to encourage young people to become smart. We want to encourage education. We consider that a good value in society. But I think, this is something I've been thinking about actually through this whole conversation, is I think part of the problem also is balance. And here's what I mean, is that we like people to be smart, and we want people to be smart and well-educated. But there's such a thing as being too smart and too well-educated. And I think we look down on that as a society. We look down on unbalanced people. And the same way we look down on an athlete that's just a true meathead that literally only has their physicality and nothing else.
We do.
Maybe American society, American society probably celebrates that a little more than they should, but I think there's still that idea of the dumb jock is still in society, which is considered a derogatory term. To a point, anyway. In the United States, it maybe isn't as much as it should be, but whatever. And then I would argue that the nerd is their counterpart. The idea of that someone who is too smart in some ways or too much in their own head, that's actually also considered a bad thing. Maybe in American society worse than it really should be, but whatever. Depends on, again, North American society versus other countries. But again, we do want people who are balanced. We do want people who are, smart, but maybe not too smart, or but also somewhat charismatic. They can talk to people. They're also involved in athletics. It kind of goes back to the whole, actually, ironically enough, the whole Doc Savage idea of someone who's the whole package. We actually do, believe it or not, value that the most. Someone who is well-rounded and is capable in all different areas, even if they might not be 100% master of all those areas, but they're really good in all those areas. I think we value that. And most of our heroes, at least our traditional heroes, are those kinds of characters. I mean, just look at even the Marvel movies that people are crazy about, which again are Marvel superheroes, but they're all of that ilk. Like, they're all characters that are basically, for the most part, fairly well-rounded in one form or another. They're all smart, but they're also all physically able. They're also, somewhat charismatic. They have their issues, but for the most part, they're all Renaissance men of one kind or another who are actually kind of ideal humans, because that is kind of our ideal that we're still working towards, or that we lean towards anyway.
Maybe. I think, again, it fluctuates. That to a certain degree at the moment. I think we're in like a hug a nerd phase. Okay. And that was because, like we said way before on our nerd podcast, there really aren't nerds anymore. It's being intelligent, being like dedicated to some ideal or some hobby or some interest. It's not really seen as a negative thing. But I think it's cyclical. I think you might start seeing, especially because now people are getting afraid of the internet and they're terrified of Facebook kind of thing. You might see it go the other way.
I disagree, and I'm going to tell you why. I don't think it can go the other way, at least not in North American society, and here's why. Here, I'll explain my first idea first. Okay, so I don't think it's going to go the other way because we're about to engage in a huge wave of automation of one kind or another. And as a result of that automation that's coming in the next 10 to 20 years, there's going to be even more competition in society for a much smaller number of jobs. And the jobs that do exist are going to be highly specialized and require a lot of intelligence to be successful at. In fact, the people who are going to be most successful in our society are going to be the smart ones. The ones who are not as smart, the ones who were traditionally the laborers, the ones who were kind of the middle tier people, they're going to be left behind. And society is just generally going to be focused on the people who are there at the top. And if it sounds like I'm talking about, some kind of Elysium type scenario or that, yeah, I am actually. Or Megacity 1, there's a better one. Yeah, I am actually, because I see that's kind of where I think things are headed towards. Maybe not quite as bad as Megacity 1, I hope, but heading towards a situation where, basically the smartest people are going to end up being the elites of society, because they're going to have machines and other things to do all that grunt work that everyone else did before. Yeah, but they might not be truly smart people, because God knows people in corporations are not always truly the smartest ones. But I think that there's going to be that value of intelligence is going to be very highly prized in society, because that's going to be the way to get ahead.
Yeah, but I can see it going the other way, that what ends up happening is because of technology and automation, there just aren't that many spots at the top. So no matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter, because, the third generation son of, the Richington family has already got that spot. And you'll see the intelligent become villains again, because there'll be symptoms of the technocracy that's keeping us all down and took all of our jobs and has us like sitting around the burning oil drums full of pallets.
And the other thing that I could see happen, just to continue your line of thinking, and go against what I was just saying, though, is that I can see the dumb jock heroic character becoming the lead hero in stories again, or that glorification of the average man, simply because that's who they're selling the product to. They're glorifying it because no, you don't want to be at the top. Being average is awesome. Don't worry about it. Just drink your soma and enjoy your 3D holographic porn vids. It's okay. That's normal. That's the way life should be. Just enjoy yourself down there.
Actually, no. You know what you just invented?
What?
The next iteration of cyberpunk. Because if you remember cyberpunk, and this kind of goes with what Jack was talking about a little bit ago there. The heroes of cyberpunk could utilize the technology, but they were instinct. They were always like people of the street. They were fighters. They had a rough life. They weren't pampered. They were all reaction. There was very little intellect for most of them. And I think you might see that again. I mean, it's kind of the same thing that you saw like in the 70s going into the 80s with all the exploitation tough guy cop films. That there was this idea that the engineers, that society, people at the top, the intellectuals who did all their yak and let us down and things collapsed. So now we need the tough guy man of action who's just all instinct and ignores the book and slams against society and blows shit up. And I think, yeah, that might become real life at a certain point.
Wow. Cool.
Or not. It depends. It might not be so cool to live it, but we'll find out.
Well, it'll be cool if we're outside of that,
Exactly.
looking in.
Yeah, we're exactly. Yeah, you don't want to be in the middle of all that, but okay. Well, so society could go either way. Actually, I'm starting to think it might go towards Don's. Well, it'll flux, right? It'll go back and forth. I think within certain parts of society, intellectualism will be valued, as it always has been, but within other parts, it won't be. And I think that Hollywood has been very good at pitching itself towards the lowest common denominator, as I mentioned earlier, and that includes intelligence. So that's one of the reasons why everything is pitched towards something that your quote-unquote average man, which is not really all that average, which is mostly about a 13 or 14-year-old level, can understand. And I think that's where they're pitching everything, so that's their idea of intellectualism as well, is someone who's a little smarter than a 14-year-old.
I think I wouldn't be as judgmental about it. I think you're right. But I think, and this is one of the problems you get with modern day mass media, is I wouldn't necessarily say dumbing down, but they got to simplify things because, again, you need, like if I'm spending $100 million on a movie, I need as many eyeballs watching it as possible.
Exactly. It's economics.
So I got to kind of smooth it out so that I'm going to not cheese off as many people as possible so that I can get them interested in my product. But that leads to that idea that, number one, I can't really put too many controversial or in-depth things because people won't be part of that and won't understand it. And number two, the audience themselves starts getting climatized to the dominant formula, which I think is again why you get, say, for intellect, you get that flux because it kind of depends on what's going on in the world, what kind of intelligence we value, and how we value, because people want results.
Speaking of results, though, guess what? If you make a movie that's entirely based on System 1 and doesn't require the audience to think, they tend to like it a whole lot better. In fact, that goes back to, I think we talked in a previous show about, the one big idea rule, where you can add, one big new thing to a story and expect the audience to accept it. But if you add more than one big idea, they won't accept it. That's System 1 and System 2. Think about it. What you're doing is, the stuff they already accept is all System 1. As soon as you introduce new ideas or things that push them a little bit, that's System 2. And so
that's my Green Lantern axiom.
Yeah, it is, actually. Yep. It does come back to your Green Lantern axiom. Which, again, is the idea that you just can't put too many big things in a story. You can't require them to do too many System 2 things, otherwise they won't like it.
Right.
And
that's right.
This is one of the reasons why we don't really make, to be blunt, intellectual movies. I mean, there are still some, but they're mostly done as indie movies, and they'll never see a widescreen... They'll never see wide distribution, is because they won't make that much money, and the studios know it. I mean, during the new Hollywood era of the 70s, they would make films that actually challenged the audience in one form or another. Even while they were bemoaning, saying, "Oh, it's all being so dumbed down," but actually compared to today, no, they were producing gold in some cases. They were really making the audience think. Like a classic example would be Kramer versus Kramer. Yeah. That movie would be never made today because it forced the idea to think about issues and to think about what divorce means and who should have children and all these issues. People don't make issue movies because people don't want issue movies. They don't sell well. They don't make money because they require the audience to use System 2 to think. And the audience doesn't want that.
Glengarry Glen Ross, right?
Yep, there we go.
Thing.
Yeah, exactly. They're rare as hen's teeth because they don't generally make money unless you really are good at sneaking it in.
Yeah.
And then any depth you show now in a standard Hollywood film is considered a wonderful show of intellectualism, even when it's really not, because you've just stepped above, you've used a tiny bit of System 2, and if you make any use of System 2 whatsoever, that's considered intellectual at this point.
So in other words, System 2 movies are more likely to win Oscars.
They are, actually. That's pretty much what they are. Yeah, if you look at any Oscar winner, it's probably a System 2 movie. It's probably more... It has more System 2 content, but not too much. Just enough.
Actually...
So that it makes the audience feel smart about themselves, that they understood it, and they got it, and they were willing to sit through it.
I think there's a catch, though, because I think you guys have hit upon that idea, because historically, a lot of the big Oscar intellectual award-winning movies aren't necessarily really popular. But I think because what's happening is the people who vote for things like that and tend to rate things like that tend to have that supplementary knowledge. They've studied film, they've compared film and that. Whereas the average person doesn't care. We just want to see how did they put that in Generation X? Tits, guns, and explosions.
The Michael Bay approach.
Yeah, basically.
Yes.
But and then that's the thing, and that's where you get that disconnect between film scholars and the audience, because the scholars are the ones that, like I said before, took that time to develop that supplemental theoretical knowledge about films, whereas the audience just enjoys, sitting down watching a film.
Yep. Tits, guns, and eyeballs. That works.
My friends, I have to say good evening to you. I have to go pick up my lovely wife, but thank you so much for giving this intellectual System 2 show for me to think about. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for coming on and contributing what your System 2 could come up with to this this discussion, Jack.
Sounds like
Continue, and I will listen to it when it's on the podcast.
Exactly.
Sounds like some weird cult handshake.
Exactly. Good night, Jack. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. And a merry System 2 to yourself as well.
Exactly. There we go. But to continue on, so... I think that, and I've been thinking about this for a little while actually, is that I think one of the keys to being a successful writer in some ways is actually knowing exactly how to skirt that line between System 1 and System 2 in what you're producing. Because remember, when most people are enjoying a book or a movie or whatever, they usually are talking about how they're immersed in it. Like they basically become part of the story and just go with the flow. That's all System 1 stuff. And I think that for the best writer is one that actually has that balance. You need some stimulation. You do. You can't make it completely baseline System 1. And that's the thing, right? When we're talking about
you can.
Well, that's called porn. But anyway.
I was going to say, no, it's called the Transformers, but whatever.
Yeah, okay. Good point. A Michael Bay film. Yeah, good point. Even when we say System 1 and System 2, Daniel Kahneman himself said that those are super generalizations first and foremost. There is actually more systems, but those are kind of those are almost blocks of systems, and so they're also a range. So you can get stuff that's baseline or even minimal System 1 stuff, and then you can get high functioning System 1 stuff as well.
Right.
And so there is stuff, and I'd say that the best entertainment usually sits either kind of midline or to highline System 1 stuff. And the reason I'll say this is because the audience still has to get something out of the story or feel that they're getting some kind of knowledge or something out of that story, or they won't be satisfied.
Yeah.
There has to be something there that's giving them something. It can be, I think I talked about this before, it can be emotion, it can be novelty, it can be information, it can be skills, whatever. But it can actually, those are all things that the audience has to feel that they're getting from a story, or else they won't really, or perspective, that was the other one I was forgetting, or they have to feel that they're getting these things from a story, or else they're not going to be kind of unsatisfied. The story will come across as being, well, there'll be nothing there, basically. And even with porn, you're still getting emotion out of it. You're just getting a heaping helping of emotion. Well, lust is an emotion. There's definitely stuff there. I rank that with emotional experience. Let's put it that way. And even a Michael Bay film, again, it might be focused purely on emotion. You're not getting much skill or intellectualism from a Michael Bay film. or knowledge or much of anything. You're just getting emotion, basically, and maybe some novelty if you haven't seen that kind of explosion or that kind of shot done before, I guess.
Well,
but there's definitely a market for that.
There's I think what we're going to have to do is link to the epic rap battle of history with Steven Spielberg versus Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh, interesting. Why?
It ties in a lot with this idea of emotion versus intellect, and it sounds strange to say, and it's funny. It's one of their best ones, but it kind of ties into some of what we're getting at. One of the things that I'd always heard when it comes to producing any kind of entertainment is you always kind of want to wring the emotion out of what you're doing. That tends to be the focus. And I can kind of see, because I think that's like you're saying, you're giving the audience something. That's what they're going to get. But I think one of the things you can do that we don't get for a while is you can always put a little intellect underneath that.
Yes, you can.
And that's where you get, like, if you do something a little different, or if you've got a story that sort of comes together. And I think this is one of the reasons why so many, like, movies and that are forgettable. Like, they come out, they're the most important thing ever for, like, a month, and then they just totally disappear because they don't make that impact. Because, again, and I think we talked about this a long time ago, too.
Probably.
I've always subscribed to the idea that what sticks with the audience is the thing that they can't rationalize.
Okay.
And that's why most movies are totally unmemorable. Like, even going back to the past, a lot of them, because they never give you that one thing that you just can't. It's like the piece of popcorn stuck between your teeth. You don't get that. Because that's the thing that keeps you coming back. That's the cognitive dissonance. That's the aspect that makes you think you're onto something, that you found some, like, obscure clue or important koan that if only I could solve.
Actually, I just finished a book by a guy named Brian McDonald, who wrote a book called Invisible Ink. He's actually a Hollywood screenwriter. And that's the stuff he would refer to as invisible ink, which is where the title comes from. The stuff that's between the lines, the stuff that's implied, the subtext, the things that the things like, for example, dramatic questions that are part of a story, but they're created naturally and they almost run on a subconscious level while you're experiencing the story. Yeah. And I think that that's what you're talking about, is that there has to be something to a story that, yeah, as you said, you can't quite, you're not completely comfortable with it. It raises some kind of question in you that you're not really able to deal with, and so you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? And so often you'll come back to the story again because you're still puzzling over that issue. And I think if it's done well, going back to the whole System 1 and System 2 thing, that makes me suspect that what's happening is you've managed to slip in a System 2 level problem while keeping the audience in their System 1 state. So they don't quite know how to handle that, and so their brain is kind of stuck. You don't give it to them in such a way that it actually triggers System 2, but System 1 can't quite deal with it.
And I think that's why an example would be when Silence of the Lambs came out.
Right.
Everybody loved Hannibal Lecter. And I think it's because he was clearly the villain. But there were a couple of times where he went, no, he's got a good point there. And they did that without ever making him not be the villain. And that was why that stuck with people, because...
Actually, I would disagree in some ways. I don't think he's the villain of the story.
He's not the villain. Buffalo Bill is, but he's definitely a villain.
Oh, Hannibal Lecter's a villain. I wonder, but in a lot of ways, if you really think about it, he's actually more of just like, he's a mentor character. He's actually closer to Obi-Wan Kenobi than he is Darth Vader in a lot of ways. He's just a really sick and twisted Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, I'd say he's probably closer to Palpatine, but yeah, I think, and I think that's the idea, is that he's the mentor. He contributes to the hero, but he never stops being evil while he does it.
There's an old bit of writer advice that the best villains are ones that the audience, even for a short, brief period of time, emotionally connects with.
Yeah.
If you can make them emotionally connect with someone that they really know they're not supposed to, it throws a monkey wrench into their thinking, and they have to kind of work hard to rationalize that. and think about, well, why do I agree with that bad guy? What's up with that? And it has an interesting effect. It will often either make them hate the bad guy more because it's kind of like they're pushing the idea away, or they find that bad guy even more attractive and interesting, and so it brings them to life more. Sometimes both.
Yeah. Well, and again, too, it makes sense because it's. I think you're right that what happens in a case like that is you're getting that emotional kick, but yeah, it makes that little bit of intellectualism kick in, and it's not enough to frighten you. It's not enough to make your brain hurt, but it's just enough to make you feel like you've achieved something a little bit more because you've used that muscle you haven't for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if you're someone who is inclined to use those muscles and actually enjoys them, so to speak, it will definitely make you feel a little bit better. Actually, I just had a thought. Okay, this is a slightly tangential to what we're talking about because this is writing theory, of course. But this is closer back to our original topic. Is the fact that pretty much every villain is intellectual of one form or another, almost always, in our pop culture and media in North America, is that inadvertently demonizing smart people? Is that inadvertently actually creating an anti-intellectual bias in society?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it's creating, because I think if it does have an influence, it cues up with something that's already in people's heads. I don't think it's putting like a brand new idea.
Right.
I think what you end up with, because when you guys were talking about this, I was thinking part of the problem with writing and why your villain tends to be the intellectual is because the villain tends to be the motivator.
True.
Like, they have a plan because the hero has to react to that plan. And a villain who and you can do a story where the villain is just like, me smash.
Oh, you can. You totally can. I would argue. Okay, there's a catch to that, though. Well, you can. It depends whether you have a changing or unchanging lead, right? Because if you have an unchanging lead, then the villain has to be the one who's doing all the work because the hero's not going to change anyway. So the villain has to be the motivator because in a lot of ways it's usually the villain's story, not the hero's story. It's about them trying to do something and the hero reacting to it. With the unchanging hero. If the hero is changing, usually there's someone who is they're the motivator of the story, and the villain is the one who's pushing back and keeping them down.
Yeah, they can be, but I think, again, more often than not, the villain is the thing that sets the story in motion.
Usually, yes.
Yeah, because they're the ones that disrupt the natural flow of things, and most stories are about something that disrupts the natural flow of things.
Well, it's usually called the inciting incident in most screenwriting books. And it's an event that comes from outside the main character's life that basically gets them off their couch and gets them off their phone and puts them into the game, so to speak. And it can be as simple as in a murder mystery, it's, the jogger finds a body and suddenly the cop, has to get up at 2 in.the morning and, has a fight with his wife and then goes down and smokes a cigarette and says, "What do we got here, Ed?" It can be that, or it can be a character stumbling across a crate that dropped out of a truck that happens to have a suit of powered armor in it. I mean, it can come in all different forms, but some kind of inciting incident has to happen that's outside the character's control that kind of sets the ball rolling.
Yeah, although to absolutely confound the issue further, when you enter a hug a nerd era,
right,
it's usually the hero that starts things, and the hero is the smart guy. Because I'm thinking, like, say, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Ferris is the instigator.
Yes.
You're looking
actually, you could make an argument that Ferris is actually the villain in some ways too.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen a few different takes on what's actually going on in that movie. Because
there's a couple cracked articles about it, I think.
Yeah, because apparently there is one scene that got taken out. And it adds a little bit of depth to things. And tying in with our conversation, it sort of makes me not wonder why it was taken out and feel a little sad that it was taken out. If you remember when his sister meets that guy at jail, I forget his name. He has a story.
Right.
the whole premise was the reason that Ferris wanted to take what was his name? Carmen, was it?
Yeah, Carmen, yeah.
He wanted to take Carmen out because he says that this guy's never had a day of fun in his life, and he wants they're almost going to graduate, and he wants
Or Cameron?
Cameron, that was
Cameron,
it, yeah.
yeah.
And he wants Cameron to have this good day and have a taste of life, because that way he doesn't, I believe the phrase was, just marry the first girl he lays, and then his life is over, kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
There was an extra scene to that where Ferris explains that there was another kid that was kind of in Cameron's shoes, and he was kind of withdrawn in that. And this kid ended up getting into some bad shit, and he ended up like dropping out of school and throwing away his life. And he doesn't want that happening to Cameron. This was somebody that he tried to help, but he couldn't. And in a way, that whole day is Ferris trying to make up for that mistake that he made.
Okay.
That guy in the jail is that kid that he failed.
Okay.
That was why. Because if you remember, they show him. And it's like Charlie Sheen. He was an actual known actor, and he's in it for like 4 minutes. And you're like, why is this? And that was the original story. Which again makes him less of the villain. Like,
yeah, that's true. He's doing the right thing, or at least as he sees it anyway. Okay, that makes sense. But so back to your original point.
That's the idea. I guess it doesn't really help that thing at all, because I think the anti-intellectual thing is always kind of there to some degree. And I think it might be because like you guys were saying, that the type 1 thinking, the reactive, the gut, the truthiness kind of thing, comes easy, whereas the type 2, the intellectual, the sitting down, pondering out, it doesn't come natural, and it takes more effort, and that's why we tend to shy away, especially entertainment. Especially in the last decade or two, because like we said, there's a lot more pandering because there's a lot more competition for audience. That the idea of anti-intellectual was sort of a byproduct, and that was where the idea of wisdom is kind of your workaround, because that lets you have a smart character who doesn't become that, Poindexter, cold-hearted intellectual.
Right. And it's interesting, actually, at least in traditional, going back to Asian culture, since it seems to keep coming up, because, again, they have the different view of intellectualism, though. I do find, actually, a lot of their detective characters actually usually tend to be more wise than they are actually smart.
Yeah.
Because it makes them much more relatable. I mean, it's the Columbo thing, basically.
And I think that's part of it, too, because I think if you're going to look at, like, China and Japan and Taiwan and like the Far East, I think there's a tendency too that we're seeing them as being more different than they actually are.
Well, they're still human beings.
But I think even it's just the trappings are different, but the idea is there, because you're absolutely right, and there does seem to be more of a tradition, even in somewhere like Japan that is 20 years into the future from us, of hanging on to some of these old ways and these old traditions and these old perspectives. But like I say, we do that here too. And that's where you get, like I say, like the homespun detective and the old country doctor and that. I think that's our version. And I think it serves that same function. It's that idea of the tried and true. It's that idea. It's intelligence with warmth, which feels more like just reaction. It feels more like type 1. It's acknowledging the past. It's fulfilling that same role.
Well, keep in mind, sorry to interrupt, but this just suddenly occurred to me. Also, with wisdom, there's the catch, right? In theory, all of us can be wise. In theory, you can always tell yourself, well, one day I'll be like the old country doctor there in that drama or whatever. Whereas not everyone can be smart, and most people know it. I mean, we all have our basically range of intelligence where we're going to sit, and it's mostly determined by genetics and a little bit by upbringing, but I'd say mostly genetics.
I don't know. I think anybody can be smart. You might not be like Stephen Hawking, but you can develop an intellectual streak.
Oh, you can. I'm not arguing with that. I think that IQ can be developed. As I said earlier, the brain is like a muscle. You can work it, but I will never be Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that's just not going to, just the same as I will never be Stephen Hawking. I mean, we have our own built-in limits, whatever they are. We have our own kind of natural range where we sit. That doesn't mean that we're stuck at that level. It doesn't mean, say we couldn't go 10 points up or 10 points down, depending on how we do things. But I do think that each of us has our own limitations. Yeah. And we're aware of that. I mean, your average person doesn't think, I could be just like Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah,
but your average person...
Do.
What?
Some people do.
Some people do, that's true. But I think your average person can still look at Matlock there and go, yeah, I could be just like him when I'm older.
Yeah, maybe. Because I think you might have hit part of why pure intellect is typically the domain of the outsider.
Hmm? Why?
Because like you say, because it's the sort of thing that a lot of us, whether we can or not, we feel like we'll never be, we're not going to be Einstein.
Right. Yeah.
And then that's why somebody who is Einstein is they're a little out there. They're different from us. They're a little apart from us to some degree.
Right. Well, actually, if you're Einstein, you're more than a little apart from most of us. Same with Stephen Hawking.
Kinda.
Here's a weird thing. I think that part of the reason why Stephen Hawking was so popular and so accepted was because of his disability. Even though he was literally a godlike intelligence, he was trapped in this shriveled, crippled body. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't threatening at all. People looked at him and said, "Oh, he's this kind of like weird crippled cousin that or uncle that people could still kind of relate to him in a weird sort of way because he had that weird balance where he was so physically crippled, but intellectually he was so gifted." And so it go back to my idea of balance earlier. Whereas if he had looked like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and had that intellectual streak, I think people would have been fucking terrified of him.
It's true, and I think that ties in too because one of there's a common myth about Einstein that he was like crazy absent-minded. He'd do stuff like leave his house without pants.
Yeah,
totally not true.
I could see that.
There was the myth that when he was a kid he sucked at math. Totally not true. He was really good at math.
Well, again, that goes back to the idea of two things. One, they're trying to humanize them, and two, they're trying to go with that idea that we can all be just like him if we work hard.
And I think you're right too that it's that idea to humanize a bit, that if he's got like some kind of weakness.
Exactly.
Because Einstein is kind of the embodiment of the scary intellectual for a really weird reason.
He created nuclear weapons that could kill us all?
No, technically he didn't create them. They just kind of took what he came up with and used it. But when he came up with his general theory of relativity, and I remember this because I had a professor at university that told us this story, and it kind of always stuck. Because he said that was kind of where you started getting the separation of intelligence from the average person. Was that this theory comes out, and there was this big article that came down the wire about his new way of, essentially the beginning of quantum physics. And it was, the headline was something to the effect of, "Brilliant new theory of reality that's only understandable by 8 wise men." Those 8 men being the first scientists that had reviewed and discussed it.
Right, yeah.
And this was what the professor said was the beginning of this idea that the lofty levels of intellect were way beyond the average person, that you had to be some kind of mutant, was that article.
Huh.
And it's interesting because I do think that we do have this need of making the intellectual defective in some way so that they don't just take over.
Yeah, we're terrified of, the super intellectuals who will just walk all over us.
Yeah, so they have to be, and this is where the idea they have to be like the socially inept Poindexter, or their body has to be withered somehow as their intellect developed, or they have to be like totally absent-minded and goofy. Because this ties in with something I was thinking about going the other way, that another big myth of society is that serial killers are intelligent people. They are totally not.
Well, they always are in stories.
There are, but in real life too, there's this idea. I think there's been 1 or 2 of the big name guys that they discovered were actually really smart, but most of them aren't.
Huh.
But we have this idea, like, what the hell? The guy who was on The Dating Game, Rodney Alcala. Yeah, I think he was kind of one of the guys that they found was kind of had a high IQ, and then that stuck. But when you look at most of them, they're not actually really intelligent people. When you think about it, the BTK killer, they caught him because he sent his manifestos out on disc, on old school floppy disk, and he phoned the cops up and said, "Can you trace like a floppy disk?" And they said, "No, we can't." And that's how they caught the dumb fuck. But and there's a bunch of them they discovered they weren't really. Some of them had like well below average. But there's this myth that serial killers are these like geniuses, and I think it's because on one hand, we're always kind of afraid of the really smart guy. And on the second hand, we like to think that the only reason they can get away with this is because they're smarter than everyone else, and not because our system isn't really set up to deal with a mass murderer, because that's such a weird, rare event.
Exactly. And on the third hand, for those of you who have three hands, going back to what we say, every villain in a story has to be, a smart guy for various practical reasons in the story. So whenever they introduce a serial killer character, they're always some like crazy genius usually.
Well, they are now, because when you mention that, going back to like the 70s, a lot of them weren't that smart.
Actually, that's true. Even if you go back to Dirty Harry, when I think about it. The original Dirty Harry film, the character played by Andrew Robinson, whose name escapes me. I just remember the actor, because he was on Deep Space Nine, and he was Garak on Deep Space Nine, and he's a great actor. Anyway, if I remember it, his character was pretty average intelligence-wise. He wasn't dumb, but he wasn't some genius either. He was no Hannibal Lecter. Yeah. And I've seen older stuff where, they tend to actually be a little bit crazy and a little bit feral, but usually they're not that smart.
Yeah, because part of the idea going back to like the 70s tough guy cop films was that the only reason these guys could commit crimes was because society itself was broken. I can't remember the name of it, but there's like one of Bronson's first tough guy cop films.
That's like, not Death Wish.
No, I think it was one of the ones he did just before. Because he made a lot of movies that were basically just Death Wish. But he tracks this guy down, this like rapist, murderer guy, and he's got him at gunpoint, and the police are coming, and the guy is like, "And you know what's going to happen? I'm crazy. They're just going to let me out, and I'm going to do it again. Ha ha ha!" And then Bronson shoots him and goes, "No, you're not." And that's how the movie ends.
Right.
And that was the premise, that, because again, remember the 70s, there was a lot of societal upheaval in that people felt it was the system that failed. So these guys were more a symptom. They weren't intellectuals. They were almost literally monsters. Like you say, they were these weird feral guys that only got away with it because the system was fucked up. Yeah.
Yep. But then Silence of the Lambs happened, and every serial killer since then is like James Moriarty level smart.
Yeah, and I think because that established that new template. And it's funny because that comes out kind of right at the end of the Hug a Nerd thing.
Apparently nerds are evil after all. Huh.
Yeah. So, I'm wondering if there was some undercurrent it tapped into, or if technically Hannibal Lecter killed all the nerds for a while.
He kind of did in a way. I think he basically just kind of showed that, no, these nerds can be like totally evil. I think that there's something else you might be forgetting a tiny bit. We actually did have a couple financial crashes.
Yeah.
And the last couple financial crashes were mostly the fault of the nerds, too.
Yeah, okay.
So, for example, we had the dot-com crash of the 2000s. We had of course, the Great Recession. There was also one in the early 90s. There was one in the 80s as well. And I've noticed that after each one of them, it takes a little while for people to... Basically, when those crashes happen, remember, suddenly all those smart people just lost a whole lot of other people's savings and money and everything like that. So there usually seems to be a bit of an anti-intellectual backlash that happens because, damn you smart people for screwing us all over. But then eventually things kind of go back to a kind of normal where smart people are kind of respected and admired again, and then they crash the economy again and the cycle continues.
Yeah, you can kind of see that because that goes back the 2008 presidential election in the States. If you remember, one of the big Republican talking points was, experts, what do they know? Trying to tell you what to do. And I might tie in with that because, remember we had kind of a little fiscal oops happen around that time.
Yes, we did. It was a complicated election, though. I mean, technically, Barack Obama was a smart candidate. In fact, that was an interesting thing because Barack Obama was portrayed as being smart, but warm and friendly and everything like that. And he was up against McCain, who was the embodiment of wisdom in a lot of ways. And it's interesting that was the one time when Andy Griffith didn't win.
Yeah, kind of. I think there's more complexity there too, because I think I think he got hamstrung by his own party. And the funny thing, when you mention that, Obama was portrayed as one of those like early to mid 80s hip, cool Ferris Bueller smart guys.
That's true. He was. Yeah. Yeah, he was the guy you'd want as your buddy back then. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So that's kind of a weird how that keeps like kind of lap around like that.
Well, I think there is that admiration society in general for the hip, cool, smart guy. Usually, what did Simon Veil in our Russian show call it? Like the lucky fool.
Oh, yeah,
that the Russians love. I mean, that's the kind of character that always has kind of universal appeal, basically. I mean, even in our society, I'd say we still like that kind of character too. Maybe not as much as the Russians, but we do actually admire the kind of slightly foolish, more average person who just has that kind of wisdom to them and a bit of luck, and so they win.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? Weird.
Okay, on that note, I think we should probably bring this one up to a close.
Yeah, it went some strange places.
It did, actually. This was an interesting podcast. It didn't quite go where I expected, but I think we had a really good discussion.
True.
And we might even have kicked in a few people's System 2s as we had this discussion as well. At least I hope.
Well, do you realize that we kind of started edging towards kind of an intellectual, scientific explanation for a lot of, like, stuff?
Mm-hmm. That's not a bad thing, dude. It's called using System 2. It's called using your brain.
I think this is going to come back to haunt us in episodes in the future.
It probably will, yeah. Well, the problem is as you get deeper and deeper in, you uncover more and more stuff, and you start to figure out how it all connects and how it all correlates with other stuff that you talk about. And so I suspect if one were to actually go back and listen to all our podcasts from the beginning, there's probably actually a clear evolution in the things we're talking about and some of the ideas, and you can see even our own thinking changing over time about certain subjects.
Yeah. But the big question...
Exactly. Go.
Oh, I was going to say, are we going to use this for good or evil?
Well, considering that we're reasonably smart people, the answer is evil. Duh.
I can live with that.
Exactly. Me too. Good night, folks. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!